We'll get started in just a minute. There are some handouts. I've given you copies of every slide that I'm going to present here tonight. They're in the back. I think we made like 1,000 copies. Is that right? So we got a lot left over. Well, we'll get started in just a couple of minutes here. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Kevin Peil. I think many of you know me. I've been around for a while. This is really my life's work, has been looking at creation and evolution from a Christian perspective. It was actually 32 years ago that I gave my first presentation in Midland. It was in October of 1990 that I gave my first presentation on science and creation and the Bible and all of that. I've spoken over 500 times at probably 20 different states around the country. I've been to 5 major universities where I've spoken on campus. I've been to probably 100 different WELS congregations. I've spoken at every WELS teacher conference from California to New York, and it's really been a nice experience of mine. It's been a long time. I can't tell you I remember the last time I spoke at my home congregation. So this is really cool to speak at my home congregation. I'm usually standing in front of folks in a different capacity here, but now I get to talk about this here. So I'll talk for probably about 50, 55 minutes. We'll go through everything. We'll leave lots of room for questions, and then we have ice cream afterwards. So, there you go. All right, so I've got my email up there. If you wish to have an actual copy of the PowerPoint slides, I'm happy to send them to you, if you would like. There's some color slides, but there's really not a lot, so that doesn't really matter. But I'm happy to send these to you if you want. Okay? So, make sure my mouse works. Well, I know it does work. Well, let's coax it along here. Okay, so why make such a big deal about this? Why spend so much of my life studying about creation and talking about this? We're surrounded by criticisms all the time. We hear it from our friends. We sometimes hear it from our family members, our co-workers, our neighbors. We read about this stuff. We hear about it on TV. We're surrounded by these doubts and criticism about what science has to say about many biblical topics of interest. I like to tackle the hard question right up front. Can a Christian still believe in evolution? We'll tackle that question up front. Many people say the earth is millions and the universe billions of years old. Well, what do we say? How do we respond to that? What about the days of Genesis are really millions of years? I probably hear this more than anything else, is that, the 6 days of creation, those really represent millions of years. What do we say? How do we respond to that? Maybe God used evolution to create everything, right? Maybe he created life, but then he's using evolution to move things along. How do we respond to that? What do we say? People doubt Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark isn't real. How in the world could a single man build a boat and put all these animals on it and survive for 371 days in the middle of a raging storm. That can't happen. That's ridiculous. How do we respond to that? Fossils prove evolution. Humans evolved from ape-like ancestors. Genetics proves that. The fossils prove that. What about dinosaurs, carbon-14 dating, etc.? All these things are topics that I'm going to cover here. How do we respond? What do we say to people that come up to us and say, how can you still be a Christian with everything that science has demonstrated over the last 50 years? Well, I'm living proof that you can still be a Christian and a scientist with a PhD that's worked in science his entire adult life and has never wavered from this at all. In fact, everything that I studied in school, the 9 years that I was at college, at the 4 different colleges that I was at, there was nothing I was ever presented by anybody at any time that really cast any doubt on anything that Scripture said. And so I want to help you work through this and give you a lot of things that you can say, things that you can say verbatim based on what I'm going to say, some ideas that I can give you that you can craft and say in your own way as well. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to answer the question, can a Christian still believe in evolution? I get asked this all the time. I'll tell you what I don't say, and then I'll tell you what I do say. What I don't say is yes or no. When somebody says, can a Christian still believe in evolution? I don't say yes or no. I say the following. Well, consider this. Consider that the origin of the gospel is found in the Garden of Eden. The first time the promise of a Savior is given to Adam and Eve. That's where the gospel is first proclaimed. Consider this. If evolution is true, then there would have been death before sin. You see, evolution requires long periods of time of a struggle to exist, of animals dying, the fittest surviving and getting to where they are now. Many Christians will say, well, that happened for millions and millions of years, and all of a sudden a human was smart enough that had this self-recognizing capability, recognized there were a God, and then a God came down and announced himself to this person who he named Adam. But if all of that is true, then there would have been death before sin. Christians know that death is in the world because of sin. It's not part of God's original creation. There's this perfect symmetry of Scripture. You know, we often miss this as Christians, and it's really a wonderful thing. You know, the Bible ends exactly how it began. The Bible comes full circle. You see, the Bible begins in the Garden of Eden and describes a perfect paradise with mankind in perfect relationship with God. The Bible ends describing a new earth and a new garden with a tree and a river that flows through it and mankind in perfect harmony with God. The Bible comes full circle and it ends right where it started. Our relationship with God depends on the doctrine of creation. You see, if we really are here because of the struggle to exist and because of our intelligence, because of our ability to do this, and because the fittest survived and all of that, that really waters down our relationship to God. God really isn't our creator. He's more of our life coach that gave us the tools to advance that we've taken advantage of. You know, Jesus accepted the literal account of creation. You read throughout the Gospels, when he's questioned, he says, haven't you read, in the beginning, God created man and woman? Jesus believed in literal creation. You know, the whole parallel of one man, one sin, and one man, one salvation makes absolutely no sense if Adam wasn't a real person who was the first person to sin. The Apostle Paul goes through this at length in the book of Romans, where he talks about there was one man, a real man, and he sinned for the first time. And that one man and his one sin was wiped out by another man who didn't sin and lived a perfect life. You see, if Adam is this mythological conglomeration of millions of different people that existed or survived on his own through the struggle to exist, that whole concept of one man, one sin is nonsense. It makes no sense. So when you're asked, is it okay for a Christian to believe in evolution? You say, well, consider this, and go through some of these points with him. The challenge from the beginning is, where do we fit all these millions of years? right? Science talks about millions of years, billions of years. Where do we fit this, right? Do we have to fit it anywhere? Do we ignore it? Is it real? Is it fake? Is it made up? Do we have to fit it somewhere? Well, there's lots of different ways that people have tried to fit these millions of years into the Bible. I've got 3 of them up here, but I'm just going to talk about one for the sake of time, and that is they say each of the days of creation represent millions of years. And so day 1 really represents, millions of years when God was doing this and that, and then day 2 represents another long period of time where God intervened and did this or that. Then day 3 is another period of time. You've heard of that before, right, folks? You've heard of that concept? That actually has a name. That's called Theistic Evolution, right? Well, how do we respond to that? So you have this discussion with your friend or family member or neighbor, and they say, okay, I asked you about can a Christian believe in evolution, and you responded, okay, you asked me, you've given me some things to think of, but can't you consider that the days of creation were really long periods of time? What about that? How do we respond to that? Well, it all has to do with the word day, okay? They say, well, the word day can mean lots of different things, right? Here's a sentence where I'm going to use the word day 3 different ways. In my grandfather's day, it took 10 days to drive across the country during the day. Okay? In my grandfather's day, it took 10 days to drive across the country during the day. That first day, how long of a period is that in my grandfather's day? It's years. It's indeterminate. It's decades, tens of years, 20, 30, 50 years. There you go. The word day could mean long periods of time. What about this? In my grandfather's day, it took 10 days to drive across the country. How long is that word day when I say 10 days? 24 hours. You're sure of that, aren't you? We were very unsure about in my grandfather's day, but we're very sure about in 10 days. What about this? It took 10 days to drive across the country during the day. How long is that word day? Yeah. You may not know why you're so sure of this, but you intuitively know some basic rules of English grammar. And that is when you provide a modification to a period of time, you fix the period of time. Okay? When you say 10 days, you fix that length of time of day. When you say 10 days, it must be 24 hours. When you say during the day, you're fixing the definition because of that modifier that you put before that. When you say in my grandfather's day, that's not a modification. That's not a numerical or an ordinal modification, so it becomes indefinite. Okay? Pretty simple rules of grammar. But the Bible wasn't written in English, it was written in Hebrew. So maybe things are different in Hebrew. Well, the word yom is the word that means day. You've heard of Yom Kippur? That's what day is. So the word day in Hebrew means yom. The cool thing is, the grammar revolving around lengths of time in Hebrew is exactly the same as the grammar in English for lengths of time. You know, folks, the word day occurs 2,301 times in the Old Testament, and it almost always means a literal 24-hour day. Only 65 times, we're told by scholars, 65 times is the word yom used in the Old Testament to mean an indefinite period of time, like my grandfather's day. 65 out of the 2,300 times. When day is used in the plural form, 845 times day is used as a plural. Every single time in the Old Testament, it's used to mean 24 hours. When day is modified by a numeral or an ordinal in any historical narratives, 359 times outside of Genesis, it always means a 24-hour day. What's a numerical modification? 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 10 days, 20 days, 3 days, right? When you put a number before the word day, you fix the definition. In my grandfather's day, it took 10 days. Every time in the Old Testament when a number precedes the word day, it's clearly understood to be 24 hours. An ordinal modification is something like first, second, third, fourth, right? On the 7th day of our vacation, it rained all day. An ordinal modification is first, second, third, fourth, things like that, okay? What do we have in the Genesis account? The evening and the morning were the first day. ordinal modification, and must by definition be 24 hours. Evening and morning was the second day. Evening and the morning was the third day. In 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth. Every time you hear creation talking about and the word day is brought up, there's either a number or an ordinal before the word day. Basic grammar dictates that that day be 24 hours. When day is modified by evening or morning, 38 times outside of Genesis 1, you have evening and morning signifying a day. It's clearly understood to be 24 hours. Clearly understood. I like to chide people and say, if you had a chance to sit down with Moses, right, because Moses wrote Genesis, and you say to him, Moses, this whole creation account is crazy. I don't understand it, right? Days, millions of years, it makes no sense to me. Here is how you should have written it so it could be clear. Challenge people. How would you write the creation account so it clearly means 6 24-hour days? Ask them, how would you do that? Well, let's see, rules of grammar, you got to have a number before it. Okay, it has numbers. Evening and morning, every time in the Old Testament, evening, okay, well that doesn't work because it's always got evening and morning. So when somebody says to you, can't you allow for millions of years for the days of creation? You say, well, consider this, and go through this with them. Evolution and creation have two different ways of looking at the diversity of life. There is an incredible amount of diversity that exists in the world today. Look at the diversity of flowers. Look at the diversity of cats, of dogs, of horses, of flowering trees, of non-flowering trees. Look at the diversity that is out there. God loves diversity. Look around this room. Do any of us even remotely look alike? Some of us are taller, some of us are shorter, some of us are darker complected, some of us are lighter complected, some of us are heavier, some of us are thinner. It doesn't matter. If God wanted everything to be exactly the same all the time, that's what he would have done. But he didn't do that. He allowed his creation to diversify and become incredibly diverse. Now, evolution says there was a single life form that, following like a bush, branched out from that single cell amoeba, and you got today frogs, salamanders, trees, storks, dinosaurs, you name it, all came from that single cell. See, the creation view of the world has creation occurring in the Garden of Eden and God creating the original created kind, and he said, be fruitful and multiply. I'm waiting for a translation to come out to say, be fruitful and multiply and diversify. Because that would be wonderful, right? That's what we see. You see, God didn't create every single cat that we have today. He created a cat kind, and from that cat kind, we have lions, we have tigers, we have domestic house cats, we have cougars, we have cheetahs, we have all of that. As creationists, we believe that all of life had its origin in the Garden of Eden from these singular created kinds. How many created kinds were there? I'll talk about that when I talk about Noah's Ark and the flood. We think we've got a pretty good handle on that as we've studied genetics and all of that. Okay? But this is the point that I'm going to make throughout here, is the original created kinds greatly diversified for the 1,000 or more years prior to the flood. And then the flood came and wiped out everything except the animals that had the breath of life that were on the ark. See, fish weren't really wiped out in the flood. They could have survived. Amphibians that were in the water-bearing portion of their life would have survived. See, the point of the flood was a judgment on man. The unintended consequence of that was that life was wiped out. Noah was told to bring onto the ark 7 of every clean kind and 2 of every unclean kind that had the breath of life in them. And that's what he did. And we'll actually count the number of animals that would have been. Since the flood, animal diversity would have occurred, but according to strict limits. This far you shall go, and no farther shall you go, are the limits of genetics. Okay, so the fossil record. You're going to hear a lot about fossils. I used to present a lot of pictures of fossil, but it really got to be tedious. Evolution demands that the fossil record contains the record of the complete evolution of life throughout history. According to evolution, the fossil record would contain this. And I'm telling you, folks, no matter what you may see or what you may read or what you may be told, the fossil record provides no indication of the origin of the basic life forms. Every basic life form, every fossil that we find, when we find the fossil of a bat, looks like a bat. When we find the fossil of a fish, looks like a fish. We find the fossil of a giraffe, looks like a giraffe. All the basic life forms appear in the fossil record, fully formed, with no ancestral linkage going back to any period of time. Now, I know I'm just speaking here from a sense of authority to have you to trust me, but I did this last night when I was just putting the finishing touches on this. I Googled the fossil record, right? The first site that came up with was the Smithsonian Institution, and I looked at it. The first paragraph said something to the effect of, "We have found fossils for hundreds of years. There's millions of fossils. The record of the fossil that we find don't really show clear demarcations and transitions between lives. Most of the life forms that are transition are inferred, according to what I read on the Smithsonian site." So maybe we just haven't searched far and wide enough, and that is generally what you will get as an argument from folks. Okay? Here's a big thing, too, is the order of the fossil record is important to evolutionists. You see, when you dig down into rocks, the very farthest rocks you find the simplest life forms. And the farther up you go, the life becomes more complex. And the farther up yet, it becomes even more complex. And at the very top, you start to see mammals. And at the very top of the fossil record, you have humans. You see, evolutionists say when you look at the fossil record, when you dig down into a layer of rock that's a mile deep and you dig up all the fossils and you put them in order from the deepest to the highest, you see the transition of life as it goes up the fossil record. To the evolutionist, that's evidence of evolution. You see, to the creationist, it's a strong evidence for the case for creation. The flood was transgressive. This is something you probably have not heard before and what this means. The flood was transgressive. We often think of the flood as, as being this violent rainstorm, everything was killed, instantly and so on. No, not. I mean, life lasted during the flood for many months. It wasn't until 150 days that the flood reached its highest point. Okay, that's almost 5 months. I expect that life would have existed during the flood for several months up until that point, until it was all wiped out. But life would have been buried in the order in which it would have been come in contact with the flood. The simplest life forms, the amoebas, the single-cell organisms, they would have been wiped out first. Wherever they were, they would have been buried. Buried on top of that would have been the simpler life forms. The sea would have been buried first. The sea and then the land creatures would have been buried last. The more intelligent the creature was, it would have been able to evade the floodwaters for some time before finally succumbing. I think mankind would have been the last life form that would have been wiped out, as they probably would have built rafts or hung onto trees or something to try to survive, so they would have been buried last. You see, the role that the flood plays here when we talk about the case for creation is very important. Every time I go and I talk about creation science, I have to talk about the flood, because it is foundational to understanding the world in which we live in when we understand the flood. Let's start with the ark. How big was the ark? The ark was essentially a big rectangular box whose sole purpose was to float. Pretty good description in Genesis about the dimensions of the ark. And I've drawn up here my estimate of what the ark would have been: 450 feet long, 45 feet high, 75 feet wide. It had 3 decks, about 101,000 square feet. 20 full-size high school gymnasiums would have fit inside of the ark. And I always like to point out, I drew somewhat to scale what Noah would have looked like there on the lower right of the ark. You see that little black speck? That would have been Noah to scale. You see, the carrying capacity of this was about 560 railroad cars, the gross tonnage about 15,000 tons. It was comparable to the largest ocean vessels today. It wasn't until 1884 that a ship was built that was actually bigger than Noah's Ark. So it was quite an extraordinary thing. Based on this, many people have studied based on the genetics of life as it exists, our understanding of clean and unclean animals, how many animals would have been on the ark? This is one study that I've seen that shows mammals, birds, reptiles, their weight and size, and how many approximately would have been on the ark. This scientist said there were about 15,000 animals on the ark. Again, that is a criticism you'll hear. I have been told just recently, how can you believe in Noah and the ark that he would have room for 6 million different animals? And I say, whoa, where did you get 6 million animals from? Well, that's just how many animals would have been needed. Oh, well, consider this. Here are some documented articles by some scientists that have studied this, and they've come up with these numbers right here. Has any of you been to see the Ark encounter down there? So they have a sign in there where they estimate there were about 7,000 animals on the Ark. Okay? So these numbers are always being defined. We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is that it really doesn't take a lot of animals to represent the full diversity of life that we have today. How much food and water? Okay, let's say we've got 16,000 animals on the ark. How much food and water would have been needed? Well, it would have been about 2,000 tons of food and about 1 million gallons of fresh drinking water. The ark volume used, if the food consisted of hay pellets, sunflower seeds, dried fruits, grains, peas, lentil, would have been far less than 10% of the ark. It could have been stored in that. 1 million gallons of fresh drinking water would have taken only about 10% of the ark volume. In summary, all those animals that I showed on the previous slide, if you work this out and you try to position them as best you can, no more than half of the ark is needed. For the animals, food, 10 to 15% fresh water, and then Noah and his family, tools, clothing, seeds, edible plants, about 25 to 30% of the ark is needed. You see, folks, Noah and his ark is not this mythological thing that we just look at pictures of and don't understand. Christian scientists have studied this for decades, and we have a great level of understanding as to how it might have been. Now, I'm not saying it was this way, but when we consider this as to what it may have been, we come up with numbers that seem very, very reasonable. So, of all the animals that would have been killed, animals that, herded together would have been buried in herds. This is a cool picture that I like to show. This is off of Peru. This is off the coast of Peru. We're still excavating this, but this is a 370-acre site. It's about 260 feet thick, and we've categorized about 346 whales that were buried suddenly, instantly, en masse, catastrophically killed instantly over about a 4 square mile area. This type of thing just does not happen today. Volcanic eruptions are not this great. Mudslides are not this great. Tsunamis are not this strong. Something wiped out this group of whales where the collection was over 4 square miles, and they were killed instantly. Now, I'm not saying these whales were killed in the flood, but if they were, they would look just like this. Out west here in the United States, there's a place called Egg Mountain, Montana, where by some estimates there are 10,000 dinosaur fossils buried in mass over about a 40 square mile area. They're all buried together. These 10,000 dinosaurs, not 10,000 dinosaur bones, 10,000 individual dinosaurs are buried en masse at Egg Mountain. Most of the small bones are ripped apart and lay at one end of the deposit area. Scientists have done a statistical study, and they've noted that most of the fossilized dinosaurs are all pointing in one direction. The article I read, the scientists marveled that it looks like this herd of 10,000 dinosaurs was wiped out at one time, he said, by like a wall of water that hit this herd, a wall of water that was 20 miles long that wiped out this herd, ripped their bodies apart, threw the small bones 20 miles down and pointed all the bodies in one direction. And he marveled at how this could happen in Utah and Montana. and the Dakota area. There's no oceans out there. And they marvel at this. You see, folks, I'm not saying these dinosaurs were wiped out in the flood, but if this herd of dinosaurs was there when the flood hit, they would look exactly like this. So let's talk just a little bit about the flood and some of the physical evidences. We can step outside of Scripture and we can look at the world around us and we can find a lot of physical evidence for the global flood. Earth's geological features require a catastrophic explanation. Anybody that has been to the Grand Canyon knows that it's breathtaking. It's breathtaking to be the Grand Canyon. And you will be told by guides that that little Colorado River that winds through about a mile deep is what carved that out. So the evolutionary viewpoint is a little bit of water over a long time carved it, but we say from the flood, a lot of water in a little bit of time carved out the Grand Canyon. Water-deposited sedimentary rock formations cover continent-sized regions. You know, we can follow sand layers across the continents. There's a sand layer that exists that they can follow from California to the East Coast, and they've been able to match it up in Europe and branching off down in Africa. The same stream of sand we're able to match up. We're able to do that with sandstone. We're able to do that with granite. We're able to do that with a multitude of rocks that we can trace their seams in a linear fashion across continents and across the world. The only thing that makes sense is there was some catastrophic water-based means by which the sedimentary rocks were settled and placed down globally across the world. There's large coal deposits, oil deposits, ore deposits that exist that are not forming today. You know, when John Rockefeller first discovered oil in Cleveland around 1840, there was so much oil, it was literally oozing out of the ground. And he only had to drill basically 50 feet in the ground to create his Standard Oil that really dominated the oil industry for the next 50 years because the oil was everywhere. It's not like that anymore. The vast coal deposits are disappearing. The vast oil deposits are running out. These, we believe, were formed during the flood from decayed organic matter that was suddenly crushed under all of this. You know, the great fossil beds that I talked about, the rapid burial at a massive scale, the whales, Egg Mountain, the only explanation that makes sense is Noah's Ark and the flood. You know, the origin of civilization is really near the Ark landing. When we talk about where civilization first formed, it's in that Middle Eastern Turkey area is where scientists say, no, that's where kind of civilization started. Written history only goes back 5,000 to 6,000 years. Things like pottery, agriculture, domestication, metallurgy, and modern cities, we can only go back about 11,000 years with confidence to see them. Tree ring studies of the bristlecone pines date to about 5,000 years, and scientists have shown consistently it takes only about 4,000 years to build up to the 7.8 billion people today from people coming off the ark. So basically, if people say Noah's Ark was a fake, there's no way, we've been around like this for millions of years, you say, well, consider this. Go through this list. You know, population studies show that we can get to 7.8 billion people in 4,000 years. If we've really existed in our present form for 2 million years, where's the cultural evidence? Where's the city evidence? Where's the metallurgical pottery evidence? Where's the written records for this? It doesn't exist. What about dinosaurs? People will say, yeah, Christians don't believe about dinosaurs. Oh no, dinosaurs provide a powerful testimony to God's creation. Dinosaurs actually help the case for creation. Dinosaurs make the case for creation much stronger. If we didn't talk about dinosaurs, we must talk about dinosaurs and how they fit. Because people will question you, were there dinosaurs on Noah's Ark? You know, dinosaurs are reptiles. Dinosaurs were reptiles, and reptiles grow their entire life. Reptiles never stop growing. So the oldest reptiles are always the biggest reptiles. You know, we find fossilized dinosaur eggs around the world, and dinosaurs that would be so big they wouldn't even fit in the width of this church right here. Their eggs are about 6 to 8 inches in size. No creature exhibits that type of extreme scale, size, growth than dinosaurs. You see, most likely God did not send fully matured adult creatures on the ark because when the animals came off the ark, they needed to be in or just entering their reproductive prime. And if they weren't, they wouldn't have been able to repopulate the earth. You see, it wasn't Noah and his wife that were supposed to repopulate the earth. It was his 3 sons and his 3 daughter-in-laws that were supposed to do that. So when Noah would have collected the animals and the animals would have been sent to them, God would have sent young, thereby small creatures onto the ark to do this. You know, we've recently begun cutting open dinosaur fossils. One of the most remarkable things that we have discovered is nearly every dinosaur fossil we have cut open is full of soft tissue. Here is a Triceratops horn that was cut open about 15 years ago, and it was full of blood. And it was full of soft, spongy tissue. You can look at this underneath the microscope. The Creation Research Society in Texas has been studying this for decades. They put out marvelous presentations and so on. You can go to creationresearch.org if you want to see some wonderful pictures in the laboratory of them cutting open dinosaur bones and the blood coming out of them. Scientists say, well, you know, that's just crazy. It must be contaminated somehow. But, you know, it's more often than not that we don't find dinosaur fossils with blood in it versus dinosaur fossils that do have blood in it. So why is this a big deal? Well, the big deal about all these soft dinosaur tissue discoveries is that soft tissue and blood is not going to survive for more than 100 years, at most 1,000 years. Yet scientists say dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. Well, maybe dinosaurs did die out only a short time ago and not millions of years ago. You see, this strengthens the case for creation. Dinosaurs were real parts of God's creation. If they weren't extinct at the time, they would have been on Noah's Ark as small animals. If they existed afterwards for a long period of time and become fossilized, we're able to cut open their bones and find soft tissue in them. None of this makes sense in the evolutionary worldview. None of it makes sense. It only makes sense in the creation worldview. What about genetics? Well, you're talking with your person, you'll be talking with your friend, your neighbor, your family member for 30 minutes now. And they're like, yeah, okay, I get it. What about genetics? I read a lot about genetics. Genetics proves evolution. Genetics proves evolution. There has been so much stuff that has come out in the last 10 years that it's just breathtaking. I mean, I would take me 20 hours to show you all of this information, but I'm going to show you some of the coolest things. And again, this is a bit of an eye chart, but here's a paper looking at human mitochondrial DNA and what that DNA mutation rate teaches us about history. You see, we've learned a lot from studying diversity in human DNA. You've heard of, 23andMe, right? You can send in your DNA and they'll test it. You know that they have developed the complete genome for over 3 million humans in this time. And that data is available. That data is available for scientists to look at and say, oh, let's figure out how diverse humans are. Oh, let's figure out how quickly genes mutate in humans. Oh, let's see how easily that will line up to evolution and prove once and for all that evolution is true and put a final nail in the case for creation. Well, what do we learn when we look at the mutation rate of the DNA from all of this data? Does the study help make the case for creation? In particular, there's something called mitochondrial DNA. I'm going to get a little technical here, but that's okay. You've been listening to me for 20, 30 minutes, so I'm going to get a little technical here. Mitochondrial DNA. Everybody has mitochondrial DNA in them. We only inherit mitochondrial DNA from our mother. Even though I'm a man and I have mitochondrial DNA, I don't pass it on to my kids. My wife passes it on. Because of that, that actually makes tracing lineage much easier through mitochondrial DNA because you immediately eliminate half of our genome because you're only looking at the part from the wife, from the female. Well, mitochondrial DNA studies have revealed that on average, there's 40 mitochondrial DNA differences amongst everybody that's alive today. And we've gotten this from all this 23andMe study looking at these millions of humans. Everybody here, if we were to sequence your individual mitochondrial DNA, there would be 40 mutations compared to the person next to you, on average. It's probably more like 30 to 60 or whatever. But on average, there's about 40 mitochondrial DNA mutations per person. Well, what does that mean? Well, we can actually measure the mutation rate of mitochondrial DNA. Given the measured mutation rate, if there's 40 mutations that are present, scientists agree it takes about 4,000 to 8,000 years for that to accumulate. Well, how much would accumulate if we were around for 2 million years? Well, there should be about 1,000 mutations between each one of us and our mitochondrial DNA. Does this strengthen or weaken the case for creation? No, absolutely it strengthens it. Well, let's keep going. The male Y chromosome. Females have a double X chromosome. Males have an X and a Y chromosome. Men today are more than 99% identical in their Y chromosome. Just like women pass on their mitochondrial DNA, men pass on their Y chromosome only to their male offspring. And when we look at all of the men today, they're 99% identical in their Y chromosome. On average, every man has 600 to 800 mutations in their Y chromosome compared to the person sitting next to them. Just like with mitochondrial DNA, we know the mutation rate of the Y chromosome. It's about 3 per generation. Every generation adds about 3 more mutations to the Y chromosome. So from this, it indicates that all men are descended from the same male ancestor who lived about only 200 generations ago, and the average lifespan or reproductive time of about 30 years per generation gets us 4,000 to 6,000 years. So men, our common ancestor, existed about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. Scientists marvel at this. The whole world was wiped out, they say, and one man lived and was able to pass on his genes. Isn't that remarkable? Boy, we're so lucky that that one man lived. And we raise our hand and say, yeah, that one man was Noah, and he was in the ark. No, that's crazy. No, it was a different man. See, they want to believe in the miracle of something wiping out all life except one human, but they won't look to the Bible for that source of the miracle. I ask you again, folks, does this help strengthen or weaken the case for creation? No, it strengthens it. Here's a study. It's a little hard to see here, but you can see this in your handout. This was a study that was done with mitochondrial DNA with this African population, right? So these scientists looked at this African population and they sequenced only their particular genes, and they laid them out because they wanted to see, could we trace the ancestry back to one single person for the African continent? Well, you see those blue dots? Or those green is what they're, no, I'm sorry, the green, you see the green right in the middle of those 3 green arrows? Try as they might, scientists could not trace the African continent back to one person. They could only trace it back to 3. So the debate in the scientific community was, well, according to the Y chromosome for men, that shows they came from one male 200 generations ago. Oh no, but when we look at the mitochondrial DNA that's present, it looks like they came from 3 individuals in Africa. Does it really matter? We're talking about Noah, or we're talking about his 3 sons that we're all from. Does it really matter? Folks, this wasn't put out by a Christian. This was put out by a secular research institution that's studying human genomes. And I just laugh every time I read these things. Just as Paul said, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. What about animal DNA? Well, just like with human DNA, the more we study animal DNA and their respective mutation rates, the stronger the case for creation becomes. See water fleas. Water fleas have been studied. Water fleas have said to have been around for 8 million years, and due to the measured mutation rate in water flea DNA, they should have about 150,000 DNA differences between them. We measure only 600. Well, maybe they haven't been around for 8 million years. Maybe they've only been around for 4,000 years. What about the fruit fly? Fruit flies have said to have been around for 20 million years, so they should have an average of 500,000 DNA differences over that time. But when we measure them, we consistently get a number of about 2,000. Roundworms are said to have been around for 18 million years and should have on average 2.5 million DNA differences over time, yet we measure only 1,600 differences. Scientists marvel that the more they learn about genetics, and they thought the more they learned, the more it would cement the case for evolution, and it does exactly the opposite. It provides stronger evidence for the case of creation the more we study DNA. So what do all these studies mean? Well, one of the basic features of evolution is random mutation accumulating over time, giving rise to the vast diversity. Yet over the last several decades, we have measured DNA mutation rates for a host of animals, and the results of these studies indicate that DNA mutation load better reflects animals and mankind being around for thousands of years and not millions of years. Let's talk specifically about humans and chimps. You know, how many of you have ever heard that there's only a 2% genetic difference between humans and apes? Have you ever heard that? There is nothing more false than that. It's ridiculous how that keeps being said. That traces back to the 70s and 80s when scientists took about 0.5% of our DNA and looked at the melting point. They melted it, and it was only 2% difference from the melting point of chimpanzee DNA. From that, the myth of the similarity in our genes of being only 2% difference arose. Well, we've been studying this for a long time. Much further research has led to the consensus today that there's about an 84% similarity between them. In order to get 16% difference, right, if there's an 84% difference, in order to get a 16% difference, we're going to need about 1,000 beneficial mutations every generation for 100,000 generations to get a chimpanzee to turn into a human. It's really crazy. As things now stand, this 6% disparity in the overall DNA between humans and chimps is a discrepancy that can't be ignored when no greater than a 1% difference is needed to make humans evolving from apes. So your friend, your neighbor, your relative, they say, yeah, but we're only 2% difference. Oh, hold on. I was at a talk the other day and I heard something. I heard that was based on melting point, not on actual measurements. When we measure it, we only get about an 84% difference. You know, I mean, you look at chimpanzees and you look at humans, we're physiologically very similar to one another. We eat the same type of foods. We would expect there to be some similarities before it. Chimpanzees are very intelligent, right? The ape kingdom is very intelligent. We wouldn't expect there to be zero differences between us. You know, we're 40% similar to a chicken with our DNA. Do you know that? This massive DNA study was published just a couple of years ago in 2018. This group of scientists from the Rockefeller Institute and from the National University of Science in Switzerland, they studied over 100,000 animal species using about 5 million DNA sequences. For once, they were going to prove with these 100,000 animals, they were going to show how all life was connected and all went back to one. The conclusion that they came to was the amount of DNA variation among humans was about the same as the variation observed for each of the animal species. They have this remarkable conclusion. It says, so Mark Stokel, one of the authors there, I have it underlined in yellow, he writes, it is more likely that at all times in evolution, the animals alive today at that point arose relatively recently. So what does that mean? They basically said, we studied these 100,000 animals and we looked at their DNA. It looks like all of these animals have been on the earth for the same amount of time. And in fact, their differences are no different than humans. It looks like humans have been on the earth for the same amount of time as all these 100,000 species of animals. They said that's crazy. How could that be? Some of these animals have been around for millions of years, and some for 10 millions of years, and some for billions of years, and some for only 10,000. They say there should be great differences. They're like, why is it that when we look at the DNA, it looks like all of these animals have been around for 4,000 to 6,000 years, and that's it? Well, I didn't print it up here, but in that abstract, if you read it, one of their conclusions is genetics is probably not the right way to try to prove evolution. What? What? Right? It's unbelievable what an unbeliever will believe to be an unbeliever. Right? It's just baffling. It's baffling when you read through this stuff. What about carbon-14 dating? My last topic here, where people say, oh no, carbon-14 dating, that proves evolution. It's crazy. Well, you know what, folks? Carbon-14 is there when it shouldn't be. Carbon-14, it has a half-life of 5,700 years, and it should no longer exist with ancient fossils. Anything that scientists say is more than 50,000 years old, it should have 0 carbon-14 in it. 0 carbon-14. But we find carbon-14 all the time. We find it in coal deposits, diamonds, dinosaur bones. Dinosaurs supposedly died out 65 million years ago. We never subjected dinosaur bones to carbon-14 dating because it was laughable. It was a waste of money. It was a waste of instrumentation. It was a waste of a technique. Of course there's going to be 0 carbon-14 in it. So scientists around the world keep dating fossils of dinosaurs. Here's one table. I don't know, there's about 20 dinosaurs on here. The ages that they get are anywhere between 40,000 and 17,000. Here's another group. They're dating them anywhere between 30,000 and 2,000, 33,000. Here's a third group. They're all about 20, 30,000. Every time we date a dinosaur fossil, it doesn't come back with 0 carbon-14 in it. It comes out with a lot. Now, I know these ages, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, they're a little longer than we're comfortable with. But the point isn't what the number is. The point is what the number isn't. It's not 65 million years. How is it that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, then when we cut open their fossils, they're full of blood? How come when we subject them to carbon-14 dating, we get that they're only 10,000 years old? Right? People say, well, how can you believe in creation? I say, how can you not believe in it? So what does all this data mean with carbon-14 to date dinosaur bones? Well, dinosaurs supposedly died 65 million years ago, but every time we use carbon-14, we date that they died out thousands of years ago. Maybe, just maybe, they've been around, they were only around 1,000 years ago. So, some of the better creation websites that you can go to, I've got 4 of them on here. Answers in Genesis, that would be my first website that I would go to. If you have a question about something, go to Answers in Genesis. Anywhere from the PhD detailed scientific study to something for the layman, you will find on there. Great search toolbox. Type in there a question you have, and you will find dozens of articles about it. A little more technical, the Institute for Creation Research in Dallas, Texas, that exists. They have a museum too. If you ever find yourself in Dallas, make sure to visit the museum at the Institute for Creation Research. The Creation Research Society, actually founded in Midland, Michigan 52 years ago by 10 scientists, 10 PhD scientists, celebrated its 52nd anniversary. You have to have a master's degree in some science to be a member of it. We have over 2,000 members. We publish a quarterly magazine. I have published 5 different articles in the Creation Research Society quarterly that has existed. And a lot of the stuff that I talk about, I get from those men and women that are part of the society. A number of men and women that I work with are also part of this society as well. Master Books. Master Books is in Colorado. You will not find a more extensive collection of creation science books than you will at Master Books website. And many of you have already been there. If you haven't been to the Creation Museum or Noah's Ark, you need to go there. It's quite remarkable. I actually stumbled upon Ken Ham in the Detroit airport one time. He was coming back from speaking, get this, at the Missouri Synod State Michigan Conference. And he was sitting there, and he's easy to recognize. He's like 20 feet tall, Abe Lincoln beard. I mean, he really is. So I talked to him. He was very gracious. I talked to him for a little bit. And I actually had on my St. John's Wildcat shirt, and he says, oh, St. John's, he said Luther. He says, well, what synod is that, right? And I says, well, it's Wisconsin Synod. He's like, yeah, I'm just coming back from the Missouri Synod. He said they invited me to speak at their conference, so that was cool. So building the case for creation. So my advice to you is to know the Word. I started this talk with Scripture. I started this talk with an understanding of the importance of the doctrine of creation. That is where you must start too. If you're going to talk with your friend or your relative or your Christian brother or sister, you must understand the foundational nature of creation and the creation doctrine. You must understand that. Do not waver from that. That is your starting point. Cast no doubt on there. Know the world. Know what is and what is not helpful, how much to read and when to stop. Go to these websites. Look up stuff. Some of it may be confusing, some of it may be over your head, but some of it may be exactly what you're looking at. There's a lot of good books out there. I'd be careful about what you read. I get stuff all the time, right? I just read a book on somebody trying to combine quantum physics with the Trinity. See, because quantum physics says something is and isn't at the same time. Something is a particle at the same time, and it is a wave at the same time. And this author said, it's just like the Trinity, right? He is the Son, right? But he's not the Father. But the Son is the Father, and all of this. And it's crazy, interesting reading, right? But this is something you want to be careful about reading, right? Because it can challenge you, but things like that. So, when confronted, listen. When something is being presented as fact, what is interpretation of the fact? Drill down to talk. We've all become so combative over the years, right? Especially in the last couple of years, with how crazy the world is and how upside down it is. We're so combative. Our fuses are so short. We're so quick to argue. Stop that. Back up. When somebody's talking to you, oh yeah, the Bible's crap, right? You know, scientists have proved evolution. Oh, interesting. Well, what about evolution? You know, are you interested in? Well, everything. But well, give me something. You personally, what makes you believe in evolution? What do you make people talk to you about where they're at. Don't start off and make a lecture about where you're at. Use the phrase, consider this. I don't go to church anymore because, I don't believe in creation. Oh, okay, well, consider this, right? Every time I go to the museum, all I see is proof of evolution. Oh, really? Consider this. Did you know dinosaurs, there's blood in their fossils? Did you know when we date them by carbon-14? Things like that. Oh, consider this about Noah's Ark and the flood, and so on. Talk to people. Be gentle, know when to confront and when not to confront. So the case for creation has as its core that the Bible is the unchanging, infallible Word of God. This case is constantly growing, becoming more detailed and all-encompassing. The case for creation is far more reasonable and satisfying both intellectually and spiritually than the case for evolution. Me being a scientist doesn't weaken my faith, it strengthens my faith, right? I see God's created order in a way that most people don't, right? And I'm so lucky for that, and I'm so lucky to be here today to talk to you about that. So that is my story, and it won't let me go to the last slide. So there you have it, folks. That's it. We'll stop, and so there is ice cream down in school. So that's between the questions, and that is ice cream. Yes?
How about miracles that God and Jesus created on this earth? Did you follow up on miracles? Like when Jesus would ask the Sea of Galilee, how many days did that take to part the sea?
I'm not familiar with what you're talking about Jesus.
The Bible.
Yep.
Jesus parted the sea at the Sea of Galilee.
Okay.
The Bible.
Okay. Is that true? Did Jesus part the Sea of Galilee? Does anybody heard of that? He calmed the sea. Okay, so I'm hearing he calmed the sea. I know Moses parted the sea. Yep. Yeah, I know Moses parted the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, and they also parted the Jordan River, didn't they? They parted the Jordan River too. So how long that took? Yeah. See, the thing about miracles is this, folks, right? Miracles, by definition, is not something that we can come up with a rational explanation for, right? I remember asking Pastor Brenner, when Lazarus was dead for 3 days, would he have known what heaven was like? Would he have known what heaven was like? Do you know what he told me? He said yes for those 3 days, but when he came back, God wiped his memory, and he had no memory of it. I don't know. Maybe he didn't remember that. He was dead, so he would have been in heaven, right? See, that's the thing with miracles. We got to be careful, right? Because we're trying to put a rational explanation onto something that is, by definition, outside of our understanding. What else? What else you got? Yes?
Have you participated in any scientific debates with evolutionists?
No, not personally. I haven't. I mean, I have met a lot of, very smart men and women that I've gone out to lunch with. I used to work with a man that was just absolutely baffled that I could be so good at my job as a scientist, yet believe in this. He is what I called an evangelical atheist. So we agreed that we would not have these discussions at work, so we would go out to lunch, right? And, his arguments and comments he made were things that I had heard 1,000 times over, right? They were trivial to answer. It was really quite sad how, he just was stuck in a place that he wouldn't allow himself to get out of. He was baffled by miracles, right? He was baffled by creation, how that could happen. He couldn't allow the divine to enter into the world and so on. No, I've never personally debated. There are a lot of people that do that. That's their thing. This is kind of my thing. I've given lots of talks at universities. I've spoken at the University of Michigan many times on campus. University of Wisconsin, Michigan State, University of Minnesota. I've been to San Diego State. I've been to these places and I've given lectures. Usually the student campus ministry will invite me. More often than not, it's a Wells ministry that will invite me. But when I go to these secular places, I will go if somebody invites me to go there. So, yes?
How much of a variation would you allow as far as the age of the Earth? Usher's chronology goes back to 4004 BC.
Yeah.
That one measurement you had on the possum panther when that was under 11,000. That seems like the age of the Earth. So
Yeah, 11,000 is starting to get up there. It started. When you use the genealogies of the Bible and you trace and turn them into a chronology, and that's the thing. The genealogies in the Bible are not chronologies. The genealogies are given to trace generally the ancestry of Christ. That's how they're treated. They can be somewhat selective in their pickings. So you have to recognize that sometimes they're speaking of grandfathers and grandsons when they do that. Those aren't errors. Those aren't, purposely misleading things. The challenge is when we insist on using a genealogy as a chronology, right? That's what Usher did. Usher used the genealogies as chronologies, and he was fixed, right? Because he wanted the Jewish New Year to begin right when creation started. To Usher, it made no sense that God said, this day will be the first day of your year. He said that must have been the day that God created. So he came up with 4004. But to answer your question, I generally like to say, 6,000 to 8,000 years is probably pretty good. That's a good thing. It's interesting that really, if you stay with 6,000, every 2,000 years, there's some grand intervention that God makes in the world. Year 0 and then year 2000 was about the flood. 2000 to 4000 was Jesus coming here. 4,000 to 6,000 is when? It's now. Right? It's now. 10,000 gets to be a little long, for that. I wouldn't allow that. But that's a whole other talk that I can give on all these dating techniques about the challenges that they present with things like that. So.
What do you think about that horoscope? That's mirror they got reflecting?
Yeah, so he's talking about the James Webb telescope that was launched about a year and a half ago. It just came online about a week ago. NASA just started releasing the images for this. It's something like 100 times more powerful than the Hubble telescope. It's 1 million miles away from the Earth. 1 million miles away from the Earth, right? And it's the size of about a semi-truck. And it's actually revolving around the sun as like a 10th planet. It's going around the sun. It has to be that far away from the Earth so nothing on the Earth will interfere with it. So I think your question is along the lines of when scientists say these galaxies are billions of light years away, and this star is 3 billion years old, right? How do we rectify that? How does that fit? Well, it goes back to the Garden of Eden. And what I like to say is if you would have walked in the Garden of Eden on day 7 and you would have stumbled upon Adam and Eve, and you would have said, oh my goodness, this young man and young woman standing here. Hello, Adam, how are you? This is great. What a wonderful garden you've planted here. And he's like, oh no, I didn't plant this. Oh, you didn't? Well, you're a nice, fit young man, right? How old are you? I'm 1 day old. 1 day old, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, come here, let me show you these trees, these giant apple trees. Wow, giant apple tree, it takes 40 years to grow that big. No, it's only been here 4 days. Well, how could that be? Right? You see all these birds flying around and so on and nesting. It's like this The earth looks like it's been here for a while, but it wasn't. You see, that's one of the basic tenets of the creation doctrine, is that God's creation was created and it had to be fully functioning or it wouldn't have been useful. Adam and Eve needed to be mature adults. They would have looked old, not because God tried to fool us, but because they needed to be adults. God's creation needed to be mature and fully functioning. The closest star is Alpha Centauri. It's 4.5 light years away. It takes 4.5 years for light to travel from Alpha Centauri to the planet Earth. We can see about 6,000 stars with our naked eye. The farthest star is about 1,000 light years away. So just like with Adam and his wife and the apple tree that would have looked old, when they looked up into the night sky, they would have seen stars. But how do you get starlight 1,000 light years away to the earth in an instant? Well, how do you make a human being in an instant look like an adult? How do you make an apple tree fully mature? We're okay with that. That makes sense to us because that's God. But God, would have created stars, and why not create starlight at the same time? You see, because the universe, when you look up at it, would have been fully mature. So you mean galaxies that we say are 1 billion light years away? He would have brought the light down to us? Well, if we can see it, he would have. So why do they say that galaxy is 1 billion years old? Because they can see the light from it. Now, I'm giving you a very simple explanation here. It actually gets much more complicated when we get into this. But creation scientists understand very well, how the universe exists from God when it would have been created fully mature, or it, frankly, would have been fully useless to mankind. I hope that answers your question about that. Yes, sir.
What amazes me is when you think about as far as the east is from the west, never coming back.
Yeah. Right.
The galaxy, the universe, whatever it is, we talk about the light.
Yeah. What is it? Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Not the earth. The psalmist said the heavens declare the glory of God. Right? I mean, it's just marvelous. You just look at our solar system. Jupiter? Are you kidding me? Saturn? Mars? The red planet? It's like, well, come on, God. God loves diversity. The heavens declare the glory of God. We learn from God, and we see a little bit of a glimpse of his mind when we look at the heavens and the diversity that he created out there. God doesn't like everything the same. He wants there to be that level of diverse out there, right? So I put a talk together about 5 years ago, and it's actually called The Heavens Declare the Glory of God. And I go through all of this stuff. I go through all of this stuff about how when you look up at the stars and the planets and things like that, it doesn't weaken your faith. It strengthens your faith. It absolutely strengthens your faith. Okay? Are we done? Yes, Royce.
I watched a PBS presentation on Visions with the scope last night, and one of the developers said, we are smart people and think we really know what's going on, and we have no clue.
Yeah.
He repeated it, have no clue.
Yeah. It's like every big discovery in science supposedly turns science on its head, and we have to start over. Isn't that remarkable? Yeah.
When you went to the University of Michigan, did you find a lot of different cases for creation? Did you study a lot of different?
No, not at all. No, I never studied it at all. It wasn't until I went to graduate school. I went to the University of Pittsburgh for graduate school, and that's where I got hooked up with, there was a national conference there called the International Conference on Creation, was held downtown, and it was the first time it was ever held in Pittsburgh. It's held every 4 years from now on, and I think it's held 8 times. And that was my first kind of exposure to the hard science when I went there and I looked at books. And I thought, wow, this is amazing stuff. I really need to get into this. So, okie doke, yes, ma'am.
What do you actually
Try to get through the day is what I try. No, I work for a company. I worked for Dow Chemical for 29 years, and now for the last 3 years, I've worked for a company called Corteva. So I manage one of our insecticides. We make a naturally occurring insecticide. One of the big movements is to go out into nature and find all these plants that have natural insecticides that are part of them, so that the insect takes one bite of the plant, they're like, oh, I'm not going to eat this. So we find those things, we isolate it, we identify the chemical, and then we try to make it in a chemical plant. That's what I do. So I have one of our insecticides, and I oversee 3 of the manufacturing plants. I oversee the research that goes on with it. So that's what I do every day. Yes, sir.
You make Zevo?
No. I make spinetoram is what I make.
The big thing is no chemical that hurts anybody. Kills about Zevo.
It's funny. This is our insecticide I make is called a natural insecticide. It's organic. It's said to be organic. I mean, it's full of chemicals, right? But because it duplicates what a plant does, the FDA considers it to be organic, right? Yes, ma'am.
Did you know Keith Brooks at Dow Chemical?
Keith Brooks. No, that name doesn't sound familiar. Oh.
He was in environmental
Okay.
technology at Dow.
Okay. Well, my reputation precedes me then.
He was there 26 years.
Okay, we're done. Hey, ice cream down in the school. Have a good night. Thank you all very